He probably can't even hear music, he laughed, not knowing the man in uniform was profoundly deaf. But when that same guard stepped forward, took the piano from him, and began to play, using nothing but muscle memory and vibrations, the entire crowd forgot how to laugh. Now, before we reveal the full story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The wind had teeth that afternoon, the kind that finds every gap in your coat and reminds you that London spring is more promise than delivery. Outside Buckingham Palace, tourists huddled together in that particular way people do when they're determined to have a good time despite the weather. Phones were out, scarves were tight, and the forecourt buzzed with a dozen languages, all asking the same question. Are they real people under those hats? The iron railings were cold enough to bite through gloves, but that didn't stop visitors from pressing against them, trying to get the perfect shot. Children perched on shoulders, pointed and giggled, while their parents juggled cameras and kept one eye on the time. A street performer's saxophone drifted from somewhere down the mall, mixing with the rumble of red buses and the occasional honk of a black cab stuck in traffic. Through it all, Colour Sergeant Ewan Hartley stood perfectly still behind the rope barrier, a living statue in scarlet wool and polished leather. His bearskin cap added nearly 2 feet to his already impressive height, casting his face in shadow while tourists snapped photos and made jokes about wax museums. The brass buttons on his tunic caught what little sunlight broke through the clouds, and his white belt was so clean it actually hurt to look at directly. 6 years of ceremonial duty had taught him to tune out the noise, the pointing, the occasional idiot who tried to make him laugh. He developed a kind of tunnel vision that let him see everything without appearing to notice anything. The businessman checking his watch, the teenagers plotting their next joke, the elderly couple sharing a thermos of tea. All of it registered, none of it mattered. What they didn't know, what nobody knew except his commanding officer and the medic who'd signed his return to duty papers, was that Ewan couldn't hear a single word they were saying. The blast had taken his hearing 6 years ago during a routine demolition exercise in Catterick. One moment he was calling out range clearances. The next, he was lying in a field hospital, staring at a doctor's mouth moving with no sound coming out. The ringing had lasted 3 days, echoing in his skull like a fire alarm that wouldn't stop. The silence that followed had lasted ever since. But Ewan had adapted, had to. You don't spend 4 years at the Royal Academy of Music and then 12 in the army without learning how to improvise when life throws you a curveball. He'd retrained himself to count beats through vibrations in the ground, learned to read lips by watching news broadcasts on mute, practiced standing perfectly still while his inner ear screamed at him that he was falling. The worst part wasn't the silence itself, it was what the silence had taken from him. Music had been his first language, the thing that made sense when words failed. He'd won the Chopin International Competition at 17, been offered a full scholarship to study with the best teachers in Europe. His mother had cried when he'd played Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto with the London Symphony Orchestra. The review in the Times had called him a young man touched by genius. All of that had ended in a field in Yorkshire when a demolition charge went off 3 seconds early. The tourists had no idea they were looking at a man who'd once made 3,000 people weep with a single performance. To them, he was just another red-coated mannequin for their holiday photos. A group of teenagers from Essex had been getting progressively louder near the front barrier, the way kids do when they think they're being clever. Their accents marked them as day trippers, probably up from Southend for a weekend in the city. They wore the kind of clothes that cost more than Ewan made in a month, designer trainers, expensive hoodies, phones that were probably worth more than his car. "Oi, soldier boy, you blink and you buy us a drink. Bet he's got Spotify on under that hat. Give us a wave if you can hear me." Their mates giggled and filmed, phones pointed at Ewan like he was performing monkey tricks. One of them, a tall lad with more confidence than sense and a bucket hat that screamed trust fund, started making exaggerated conductor gestures, waving his arms like he was directing an orchestra. "Dance for us, mate. Come on, just a little jig." A tour guide named Janet, who'd been walking groups around these grounds for 15 years, stepped forward with the kind of authority that comes from dealing with idiots professionally. She wore a name badge with the Union Jack and carried a small British flag that she used to point out landmarks. "That's enough now, lads. Show some respect." "We're just having a laugh, love," one replied, his grin faltering slightly under her stern gaze. "No harm done." "Yeah," added another, emboldened by his friend's bravado. "It's not like he can hear us anyway." The irony wasn't lost on Ewan. If anything, it was almost funny. But humour had become a luxury he couldn't afford in uniform. Standing guard required a different kind of strength than playing piano, one that came from absolute stillness rather than flowing movement. He'd learned that lesson the hard way during his first week back on ceremonial duty. A child had started crying near the barrier, and Ewan had instinctively turned his head to look. Just a small movement, barely noticeable to civilians, but Sergeant Major Williams had spotted it from 30 yards away. The dressing down that followed had been spectacular even by army standards. "You're not a social worker, Hartley," Williams had said, his voice carrying across the entire parade ground. "You're a symbol. Symbols don't twitch, they don't blink, and they sure as hell don't turn their heads because some brat needs a tissue." The lesson had stuck. Ewan had become a master of peripheral vision, able to track everything without appearing to notice anything. It was a skill that served him well in his silent world. An elderly woman in a cream coat moved closer to the teenagers, her voice carrying the quiet steel of someone who'd seen enough nonsense for one lifetime. She wore a small poppy pin on her lapel and carried herself with the kind of dignity that made people step aside without quite knowing why. "My grandson served in Afghanistan," she said calmly, looking directly at the boy in the bucket hat. "Lost 3 mates to an IED. You think standing still is easy? You think this is just dress up?" The boys shuffled uncomfortably, their grins fading. One mumbled something that might have been an apology. The woman held their gaze for another moment, then turned to study Ewan with eyes that had seen enough of life to recognize something most people missed. "That's a face that's seen things," she said quietly to her companion, an older gentleman with military bearing. "Look at his eyes. He's not just standing there, he's carrying something." Ewan remained motionless, eyes fixed on the middle distance that all guards learned to find, far enough away to avoid eye contact, close enough to see everything that mattered. But behind the disciplined stillness, memories were stirring. His mother's face when he'd won the Chopin competition at 17. The acceptance letter from the Royal Academy printed on thick paper that felt important in his hands. The last concert he'd ever played. 3 months before the explosion changed everything. He'd been performing Beethoven's Emperor Concerto with the Royal Philharmonic when his call-up papers had arrived. The conductor had joked during rehearsal that Ewan would be trading piano keys for rifle keys. Neither of them had imagined it would be permanent. The memory brought a familiar ache. Not quite pain, but the ghost of something that used to hurt. He'd learned to live with it, the same way he'd learned to live with silence. By accepting it as part of who he was now, not mourning who he used to be. That's when the black Jaguar pulled up to the palace gates. Hugo Laurent stepped out like he was auditioning for a cologne commercial. Navy coat tailored to perfection, silk scarf arranged just so, sunglasses perched on his head despite the grey sky. Behind him came the usual entourage. Handlers with clipboards, videographers with expensive cameras, someone whose only job seemed to be adjusting his collar and making sure he looked perfect from every angle. Laurent was having a moment. His classical meets pop performances had been trending on social media for months, dividing music critics and delighting influencer culture. He'd taken pieces by Bach and Chopin and remixed them with electronic beats, creating what he called music for the modern soul. Purists hated him. The internet loved him. His concert at the Royal Albert Hall had sold out in 12 minutes. To everyone else, it looked like an overpriced street performance waiting to happen. A few tourists recognized him immediately. Phones came out. Excited whispers rippled through the crowd. Laurent smiled and waved like he was greeting old friends. He worked the crowd like a politician, stopping for selfies and offering theatrical bows that belonged on a stage rather than a sidewalk. When he spotted Ewan standing rigid behind the barrier, his eyes lit up with the kind of inspiration that rarely ends well for anyone involved. "Ah!" Laurent announced loudly, clapping once to get everyone's attention. "Le Garde Royale! How magnificent!" Tourists turned, phones already rising. The atmosphere shifted from casual sightseeing to active entertainment seeking. Ewan didn't move, but he could feel the change in the air, the way crowds get when they sense something interesting might happen. Laurent approached the rope barrier with exaggerated reverence, hands clasped behind his back like he was studying a priceless sculpture in a museum. His movements were careful, calculated. This was performance art, not genuine curiosity. "Tell me, mon capitaine," he called out, his French accent playing up every syllable for maximum effect. "Do you ever hear the music of London? The symphony of the streets?" A few people chuckled. Someone whispered, "He's trying to get a reaction." Phones were definitely recording now, held at arm's length to capture both the pianist and the guard in the same frame. Ewan remained perfectly still, his training overriding every human instinct to respond. He'd learned to become a master of non-reaction, to let words and gestures wash over him like water off a statue. But something about Laurent's tone, the casual mockery dressed up as artistic inquiry, made his jaw tighten imperceptibly. Laurent stepped closer, raising his voice slightly for the growing audience. "Or perhaps you prefer the silence of your little red fortress? The quiet of duty?" More laughter from the crowd. A woman with a Scottish accent turned to her husband and said, "That's not very nice, is it?" But her phone was still recording. An uncomfortable feeling was spreading through the tourists, the kind that comes when entertainment starts feeling like cruelty. A woman pulled her young daughter closer. A man lowered his camera without taking the shot. Even some of Laurent's own entourage looked uncertain about what they were capturing. But Laurent was just getting started. He'd found his stage, his audience, and his unwitting straight man. This was content gold. The sophisticated European artist meets the stoic British tradition. The contrast was perfect for his brand. "You know," he said, circling slightly so the cameras could catch him from different angles, "I study human expression. The way music moves people, changes them. But you," he gestured at Ewan with theatrical puzzlement, "you are like a beautiful instrument that has forgotten how to sing." The crowd was eating it up now. Someone started clapping. A teenager yelled, "Make him dance!" The energy was building, feeding on itself the way crowds do when they sense a spectacle. That's when Laurent delivered his masterpiece of casual cruelty. "Ah, but maybe you are a little deaf to music, no? Stone ears for a stone soldier." The laughter that followed was sharper, more nervous. Several people glanced at each other uncomfortably. Even Laurent's videographer looked uncertain about what they were capturing. But the pianist was riding the wave now, drunk on attention, and the power of having an audience in the palm of his hand. "Perhaps," he continued, his voice carrying over the uncomfortable chuckles, "all that standing has made you forget what it means to feel, to respond, to be human." The words hung in the air like smoke. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. The elderly woman who'd defended the uniform earlier took a step forward, her mouth set in a hard line. But Ewan didn't flinch, couldn't flinch. The job required absolute discipline, and he'd learned long ago that discipline was just another word for refusing to let the world break you twice. What Laurent didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that his throwaway insult had just landed with surgical precision on the deepest wound of Ewan's life. The loss of music hadn't just taken away his career. It had stolen his first language, his most natural way of understanding the world. Behind the motionless facade, something was stirring. Not anger. Anger was too simple. This was something deeper. Something that had been building for 6 years of silence. 6 years of being treated like a tourist attraction instead of a human being. The elderly woman who'd defended the uniform earlier stepped forward again, her voice cutting through the uncomfortable laughter like a blade through silk. Some people, she said clearly, looking directly at Laurent, mistake stillness for emptiness. They think because someone doesn't respond the way they expect, there's nothing worth seeing. Laurent's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered with practiced ease. Madam, I am an artist. I study expression. This man is trained to suppress, not to feel. The woman held his gaze steadily, her voice gaining strength. Then maybe you're looking at the wrong kind of art. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Not everyone was comfortable with what they were witnessing. The dynamic was shifting, and Laurent could feel it. He waved dismissively to his crew, his voice taking on a sharper edge. Get the equipment. We'll show them what real music looks like. 20 minutes later, they were back with a portable keyboard on a collapsible stand, powered by a battery pack that hummed quietly in the afternoon air. Laurent had also acquired a small speaker and a wireless microphone, turning what had been a simple confrontation into a full-scale performance. He positioned himself facing Ewan, then turned to address the growing crowd with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his own brilliance. Earlier, I met a monument to silence, he announced theatrically, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone. A fortress of stone. Let us see if music can move even the most immovable. The crowd had grown significantly during his absence. Word was spreading on social media. Someone had posted a video of the initial confrontation, and people were coming to see what would happen next. The forecourt was packed now, with tourists pressing against the barriers and craning their necks to see over each other. Laurent launched into a flashy rendition of Beethoven's Ode to Joy, mashed up with something that sounded like elevator music. It was technically impressive and absolutely soulless, the kind of performance designed to get views rather than move hearts. His fingers flew across the keys with practiced precision, but there was no soul behind the notes. The crowd was eating it up, though. Phones were everywhere, capturing every moment. Someone started clapping along. A teenager yelled, "Dance, soldier!" The energy was building again, feeding on itself. Laurent played louder, showing off with runs and flourishes that served no purpose except to demonstrate his technical skill. And all the while, he kept glancing at Ewan, waiting for some crack in the perfect stillness. But Ewan didn't move. Couldn't hear the music, but he could feel the vibrations through his boots, sense the rhythm in the way people swayed. It reminded him of practice sessions at the academy, when he used to place his palm flat on the piano lid to feel the resonance of the strings. The memory brought a familiar pang, not quite pain, but something close to it. He'd been good at that once, more than good. He'd been exceptional. Laurent finished with a flourish, his hands flying across the keys in a cascade of notes that impressed the crowd but said nothing about the music itself. He stood and bowed deeply, soaking in the applause. "You see," he called out to Ewan, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone, "this is what happens when music meets life, when art meets feeling." Still no response from the guard. Laurent's smile was starting to look forced. He'd expected some reaction by now, a twitch, a blink, something to show that his performance was having an effect. But Ewan remained as motionless as carved stone. That's when a small voice cut through the applause. "Mummy," a little girl near the front whispered, tugging on her mother's coat. "Maybe he can't hear the music." The words weren't loud, but they were clear enough for several adults to hear. The energy in the crowd shifted slightly, the applause dying down. Laurent's playing faltered for just a beat. "What's that, chérie?" he asked, his smile becoming more forced by the second. The girl stepped closer to the rope, her plastic princess tiara catching the light. She couldn't have been more than 5, all golden curls and serious blue eyes. "Maybe he can't hear," she said simply. "That's why he's not moving." Her mother reached to pull her back, whispering an embarrassed apology, but the damage was done. People were looking at Ewan differently now, not with mockery, but with something approaching understanding. An uncomfortable silence settled over the forecourt. Laurent looked around at the suddenly quiet crowd, his confidence wavering for the first time. "Well," he said, forcing another laugh, "then perhaps he will feel it, yes?" He struck a deep, sustained chord that vibrated through the stone pavement and up through everyone's feet. Ewan felt it all right. Felt it in his bones, in his chest, in the soles of his feet. The vibration was familiar, comforting even. But this wasn't music anymore. This was mockery, dressed up as performance. And that's when something inside him finally broke. Not his discipline, not his training, something deeper, his patience. Without warning, without ceremony, Colour Sergeant Ewan Hartley stepped forward. One measured pace, then another. The crowd gasped as if they'd witnessed something impossible. Laurent's hands froze above the keys, his mouth falling open in shock. Even the pigeons on the palace roof seemed to pause mid-strut. A palace steward emerged from the side gate, walking quickly toward the commotion. But he stopped when he saw Ewan moving with purpose, not panic. This wasn't a medical emergency or a security breach. This was something else entirely. Ewan moved with the same precision he brought to everything else, shoulders square, spine straight, every motion deliberate and controlled. He approached the keyboard and gestured once, clearly, his turn. Laurent stared at him, confusion replacing smugness. You want to play?" Ewan nodded once. The crowd held its breath. Phones trembled in suddenly unsteady hands. "But can you even—" Laurent started, then stopped himself as he realized what he was about to ask. Another uncomfortable silence settled over the forecourt. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something deeper, more personal. Laurent stepped aside with exaggerated gallantry, but his confidence was cracking. "The stage is yours, mon soldat." Ewan moved to the keyboard and knelt on one knee, his dress uniform immaculate despite the concrete. He removed his white gloves slowly, precisely, folding them carefully and setting them aside. Then he placed his left hand flat on the plastic casing of the keyboard, palm spread wide to catch the vibrations. The crowd watched in absolute silence as he adjusted his position slightly, finding the right angle to feel the resonance through the instrument's housing. His right hand hovered over the keys, fingers slightly curved, poised but not yet touching. He closed his eyes and began to play. The first notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune floated into the air like a prayer, not rushed, not showy, just perfect. Each phrase emerged with the kind of delicate precision that comes from years of study, years of practice, years of living inside music until it becomes part of your DNA. The crowd fell silent in a way that went beyond mere quiet. This was reverence. Ewan's fingers moved across the keys with impossible grace, finding each note through memory and muscle, through the vibrations that travelled up from the strings, through the plastic housing, into his palm and up his arm to his heart. He couldn't hear a single note, but he didn't need to. The music lived in his hands. This wasn't the flashy technical display Laurent had given them. This was something else entirely. This was music as language, as prayer, as the deepest expression of human feeling. Every note was placed with surgical precision, every phrase shaped with the kind of artistry that can't be taught, only lived. A woman in the crowd began to cry silently. tears streaming down her face as she listened. A man removed his cap without thinking about it, holding it against his chest like he was in church. Children stopped fidgeting, somehow understanding that they were witnessing something sacred. Laurent stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, watching a master at work. Whatever smugness he'd brought to this confrontation had been completely stripped away. He was no longer watching a soldier playing piano. He was watching an artist, a true artist, reveal his soul to a crowd of strangers. This wasn't performance. This was confession. 6 years of silence, 6 years of loss, 6 years of being treated like a costume instead of a person, all of it flowing out through fingers that remembered what his ears had forgotten. The second movement built like dawn breaking, each phrase more beautiful than the last. Ewan's touch was perfect. Not too heavy, not too light, but with exactly the right pressure to make each note sing. His left hand provided the gentlest accompaniment, the bass notes rolling like distant thunder under the crystalline melody. Somewhere in the crowd, someone whispered, "My God." Someone else was filming, but they lowered their phone halfway through, understanding instinctively that some moments were too precious to be captured. An elderly gentleman with military bearing stepped forward, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He'd heard Debussy played in concert halls around the world, but never like this. Never with this kind of raw honesty. Ewan played the final movement with increasing intensity, his whole body swaying slightly, with the music he couldn't hear but could feel in every fibre of his being. The notes cascaded like water, like light, like something pure and beautiful that had been waiting 6 years to be released. The final arpeggio came like a prayer being answered, each note floating into the London air with perfect clarity. The last chord hung suspended for a moment, then faded into silence. Real silence, the kind that comes after revelation. Ewan opened his eyes, stood, and replaced his gloves with military precision. He returned to his post, resumed his stance, rifle positioned correctly, eyes forward, expression neutral, as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. The crowd didn't know how to respond. Applause felt wrong somehow, too crude for what they'd just witnessed. A few people tried, gentle clapping, a whispered, "Bravo!" But it died quickly, swallowed by the weight of what they'd experienced. Instead, they just stood there, looking at the guard they'd been mocking moments before, understanding for the first time that the red coat and bearskin cap held a human being. A gifted, broken, beautiful human being who'd just shared his soul with a bunch of strangers. A royal lieutenant emerged from the palace gates, walking quickly but quietly toward Ewan. Lieutenant Morrison had been watching from inside, drawn by reports of a situation at the main barrier. He'd expected to find a tourist causing trouble, or a security breach. Instead, he'd witnessed something he'd remember for the rest of his life. He leaned close enough to be lip-read and whispered, "That was 6 different protocol violations." Ewan didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. Morrison studied his face for a moment, taking in the slight tension around the eyes, the almost imperceptible relaxation in the shoulders. Then he added, "And the most beautiful thing I've heard in 20 years of service." He gave a subtle nod and withdrew, making a mental note to include this in his report, not as a disciplinary matter, but as something else entirely, something that reminded him why he'd joined the army in the first place. Laurent stood motionless beside his keyboard, looking smaller somehow. The confidence that had carried him through his performance had evaporated completely. He stared at Ewan for a long moment, then stepped forward and offered a bow, not theatrical this time, but genuine. Real respect from one musician to another. "Merci," he said quietly, his voice barely audible, without the microphone. I did not know." Ewan gave him the slightest nod in return. Not forgiveness, acknowledgement. Laurent packed up his equipment in silence, his entourage hovering uncertainly nearby. The jovial atmosphere of the earlier performance was gone, replaced by something more complex. As he prepared to leave, he paused and looked back at Ewan one more time. "What piece was that?" he asked quietly. The elderly woman who'd defended the uniform earlier stepped forward. "Claire de Lune," she said softly. "Debussy. My late husband used to play it." Laurent nodded, committing the name to memory. Then he gathered his things and walked away, his shoulders slightly bowed, his usual swagger nowhere to be seen. As the crowd began to disperse, the conversations were different, hushed, respectful. The teenagers from earlier had vanished entirely, probably reconsidering their definition of entertainment. People moved away from the barrier slowly, reluctantly, as if they were leaving a sacred space. The elderly woman lingered near the barrier, tears still bright in her eyes. She placed her hand over her heart and held it there for a long moment, then turned to her companion. "That's what music is supposed to do," she whispered. "Make you feel something real." The little girl with the tiara tugged on her mother's coat. "He played the most beautiful song I ever heard," she whispered. Her mother nodded, pulling her daughter close. "Yes, sweetheart, he did." A businessman who'd been recording on his phone deleted the video without watching it back. Some things, he realized, weren't meant to be shared. They were meant to be experienced. And Ewan? Ewan stood guard, as he always did, eyes forward, spine straight, perfectly still. But the silence around him had changed. It was no longer something he carried alone. It was something he'd taught others to understand. The forecourt slowly returned to normal. Tourists taking photos, guides explaining history, children asking why the guards don't smile. But something was different now. People approached the barrier more quietly, spoke in more respectful tones, looked at the motionless figures in red and saw human beings instead of tourist attractions. As the afternoon light began to fade, Ewan remained at his post, counting vibrations instead of sounds, reading lips instead of hearing voices, standing guard over traditions that had outlasted empires and would outlast whatever came next. But now he carried something new in his silence. Not just loss, but the memory of what it felt like to make music again. Even if he couldn't hear it, he'd felt every note in his bones, in his heart, in the hushed reverence of strangers who'd witnessed something they'd never forget. In the distance, the saxophone player down the mall had started up again, playing something soft and mournful that drifted on the evening air. The notes carried across the forecourt, mixing with the sounds of traffic and conversation and life continuing as it always did. Ewan couldn't hear any of it. But for the first time in 6 years, that felt like a choice rather than a curse. Sometimes the most powerful music comes from the quietest places. Sometimes the deepest truths are found in silence. And sometimes the guard who stands motionless at his post is the one who moves the world. Have you ever been judged for something people couldn't see? What would you have done if a crowd mocked your silence? If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another one. Tap the bell icon to be first in line for tomorrow's story. And if someone in your life still thinks the Royal Guards are just statues, send them this video. They might just change their mind. Check out our other powerful stories appearing on your screen right now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another reminder that real strength doesn't always make noise, and sometimes it just stands and lets the world discover what silence can teach.